Hi, I'm Elijah Wald, and this is Time to Connect.
Elijah Wald, hey man, thank you so much for taking the time to connect.
Sure, happy to do it.
I appreciate you being here. Really looking forward to talking to you. Um, we've actually been talking for maybe a year or so about possibly doing this, and I think the timing couldn't have been better with the new Dylan film coming out. As we are recording this, it's just going to come out a few days from now. So, want to
Yeah.
spend a lot of time talking about this. You are such a fascinating guy, though. You are so many things. You're a journalist, a historian, a guitarist, probably a few other things, and I would love to get into some of those, but let's focus mainly on Dylan, given the timing of this.
Sure.
Uh, let's see. Where are you coming to us from right now? Are you at home,
Yeah, I'm in Philadelphia.
Philadelphia? Have you lived there most of your life?
No, I'm originally from Cambridge, Massachusetts. I've been here about 7 years.
And you've lived around a number of places.
A lot of places, New Orleans, Los Angeles, a lot of years in Europe because when I was coming up, they would pay American guitar players in Europe, which was not happening in the United States. So I spent a lot of time over there.
Yeah. Yeah, I've read a little bit about your bio, and I will put links in the show notes. I encourage people to go check out your webpage, and you've got, I don't know, 8 or 10 books. What's the latest count?
More than that, I don't know. It's 13, I think, at this point,
Hmm.
something like that. It's hard
Yeah,
to figure out how to count because some of them are with other people.
yeah. Well, maybe we can do just a quick kind of potted biography, and
Sure,
obviously could be long, but give us a just quick insight into, how you came up
sure,
and how you got into music and how you got into writing.
sure. That's easy. Grew up in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Good place for getting into folk music. First concert I ever saw that I remember, my mom took me to a children's concert by Jim Kweskin of the Jug Band when I was 5. I had an older brother who played guitar. I saw Pete Seeger when I was, I don't know, probably 8 years old and decided that looked like more fun than what any of the other adults were doing. I read Bound for Glory, and this is actually one of the things people get wrong about Dylan and about a lot of us. Um, we liked Woody Guthrie's singing and guitar playing and songwriting, but those of us who read Bound for Glory at an impressionable age, more than wanting to sing like Woody Guthrie, we wanted to be Woody Guthrie. So my plan was to, as soon as I was old enough, get out on the road, be a rambling hobo guitar player. And when I was 18, I did that. Went off to Europe because it would be easier, I was told, and it was. Spent the next 12 years hitchhiking around the world, back and forth across the US a dozen times, riding freight trains, walking down the highway, and making my living playing mostly street corners, cafes, whatever, some gigging. Gradually got into writing, first of all with the Boston Globe, uh, writing about gospel music, oddly enough, and then roots and world music, and eventually started doing books, and here I am today.
Wow. So how old were you when you read Bound for Glory?
Oh God, I was probably 11, 12 years old.
Uh,
And I mean, from that moment, I wasn't going to be a fireman or a pilot or anything. I was going to be Woody Guthrie. And
yeah.
it worked out pretty well. I mean, God knows if there's one easy ambition, it's to go hitchhiking around playing guitar on street corners.
I'm guessing you also read On the Road. That probably had some impact on you as well.
Nah, didn't like it.
Really?
I've reread it and don't like it. I don't know anybody who actually has spent a lot of time hitchhiking around who likes Kerouac. I
Really?
mean, yeah, no, he writes like a tourist. I mean, there's this really, I think it's in maybe Dharma Bums. There's this passage where he's sitting on he's hopped a freight train and he's sitting on a flat car, wrapped up in his warm sleeping bag, looking at this old bum at the other end of the car and thinking, geez, those old guys, they must be really cold without a nice sleeping bag like I've got. And I mean, I've been on flat cars with those guys, and when it gets cold, they offer for you to share their blanket. I mean, it's bullshit.
Yeah. Okay. Well, that's interesting. I would almost want to have a long conversation about that, but we've got other matters to move on to.
Sure.
That's really interesting. So let's see. You didn't mention your guitar playing much. You're a guitar player as well. And am I correct that you took lessons from Van Ronk?
I did take, yeah, actually, I left home when I was originally left home when I was 17 to go to New York and take lessons from Dave Van Ronk. I'd been playing old blues already. I mean, I went to him playing John Hurt and Willie McTell stuff. I mean, and he was everything I've ever written comes out of Dave Van Ronk. He was one of the most brilliant and certainly the best read human beings I've ever met in my life. He knew everything about everything and had strong opinions on all of it. And I arrived at a low point in his life when he was very pleased to have a young guy who'd hang out through long nights as we drank whiskey and he educated me about the world.
Hmm. So that's how it happened. You just went to New York and sought him out?
Yeah, he was giving guitar lessons. That wasn't a problem. Where
Okay.
I got lucky was that very quickly he shifted my guitar lesson at the end of the day, and then he'd cook dinner, and then we'd open the first bottle of Jameson, and before 11, when the liquor store closed, he'd send me out for the second bottle of Jameson. And sometime around dawn or a bit past, I'd stagger home. And I mean, for years and years and till he died, if I was in New York, I was sleeping on his couch as Dylan had done, which I'm sure was part of the romance at the beginning.
Sure.
Um, but I mean, I can't begin to describe how much I learned from that man. Everything I've done as a writer comes out of Van Ronk.
Beautiful. And eventually that became this book, which let's talk just before we get into Dylan, let's talk a little bit
Sure.
about this. Am I right that he was working on it, trying to get you to help him, and then he
We
eventually?
were going to do it together. Um, I, from the beginning, felt like he should just write the damn thing because he was brilliant.
Yeah,
He, however, had quit school when he was 12 and wrote slowly and painfully. I mean, he wrote brilliantly, but it was slow going. So he wanted me to come in and do that with him. And then, yeah, he was diagnosed with cancer, and we thought we would try to, get the book done before he went. But, that man would do anything to get out of work. And so he died on me, and I had to write the book, but
yeah.
in his voice. And it really is his voice.
And you did a lot of research as well, finding old interviews with him and whatnot. Is that true?
Oh yeah, I found every interview I could and mined them all, and then I put it together into a book.
I've heard you say that the fun part of your projects is the research. Can you talk a little bit about
As
that?
a general thing, yeah. I mean, I like rummaging around. I like learning stuff. I don't mind the writing. I mean, some of the writing is fun. When it's flowing, it's fun. I mean, Dylan book, that was the hard. You mentioned ahead of time that you were going to ask how that process went. If we can jump to that,
Sure, let's do it.
um, sure. So that one was sort of an odd situation because what happened with that one, normally I write books because I get passionate about something or because I feel like I want to read a book and then I can't find it, so I have to write it. Like I wrote a book on the dozens, the black insult, mother insulting tradition, which I was writing a longer book and got to the point where I wanted to read the chapter on the dozen, to read a book on the dozens to write that chapter, and there wasn't one, so I had to write it.
Hmm.
The Dylan one was a little different. I wrote a book it's actually a history of popular music, but I titled it How the Beatles Destroyed Rock and Roll
Yes.
because I wanted to sell books. Um, and in, I guess, February 64, uh, I forget, I think that's it, the 50th anniversary of the Beatles coming to the US. A certain number of newspaper reporters who'd run out of other ideas called me up for an interview, hoping to get the anti-Beatles position, which I actually don't have. But anyway, it struck me that 50th anniversaries are things that people gravitate around. And I realized that the 50th of Dylan going electric at Newport was coming up. And I called my agent and said, hey, if I did a book on Dylan going electric at Newport, could you sell that? She said, hell yes. And I figured it would be quick and easy because there's been so much written about that and so many books about Dylan. I figured I'll just look at the other stuff and mine it, whip out a book quickly. It was going to have to be quick. I had at the outside 6 months. But once I started looking at it, I got more and more and more confused and interested, and it looked less and less and less like what I had thought I was getting into. And it actually turned into certainly the hardest work I've ever done in my life, researching and writing that in 6 months.
Well,
On
yeah,
the other hand, I think it helped the book because I think the book reads pretty quick because I was working quick.
I've read it twice. I really admire the book. It's about so much more than Bob Dylan, of course. It's really just about that whole cultural milieu at that time and Seeger and the history of Newport. It's a wonderful book. Anyone who's watching this who has not read it, I seriously highly recommend it. And I don't say that just to pat you on the back. It's a terrific book, man. I've probably got, I don't know, 18, 20 books on Dylan on my shelf, and that's one that I go to a lot. So congratulations on that book for sure.
Thanks.
Now, how did the film thing happen? If you don't mind, let's go back. I wanted to ask you just super quickly
Sure.
about the Van Ronk book and the Coen brothers doing Inside Llewyn Davis, because I guess it says it's inspired by your book, and obviously, since it's Van Ronk's biography, it's going to be based on it to some extent, but it really isn't,
Yeah,
a
no.
film based on the
Um,
book so much.
I mean, Dave was a brilliant, funny man. The Coens obviously read the book. There were a couple of scenes in it that grabbed them, and they went, hey, let's do a book. They had never done a New York film. They'd been living in New York since they were teenagers. They'd never done a New York film.
Mm,
And they read it and went, hey, this would be a New York film we could do. And they grabbed like three specific scenes out of the book
okay,
and used them, but created a fictional character and a
sure.
fictional narrative. It's not about Dave Van Ronk. Um, I mean, let's just say the kind of books I write, that any of them should ever be turned into a major Hollywood movie, is insanely unexpected. And the two of them should be turned into major Hollywood movies is just absurd. I feel extremely lucky.
Yeah. Well, that's cool. Did the Coens reach out to you at all during that?
Yeah, the Coens, I also reached out to them. I actually even sent in an audition tape. I wanted to play a part in the thing. I mean, I'm a huge fan of the Coens.
Yeah.
And I got to spend an afternoon sitting with them in the editing room. I could have come down and watched some of the shooting, but our schedules didn't match. But yeah, no, that was fun.
Nice, nice. And did Mangold reach out to you? I'm sure.
No, no,
Really?
um, no. Normally, I mean, nobody wants the goddamn writer around. The guy who's going to be sitting there going, no, that wasn't like that. No, that wasn't like that. No, that, you know.
Yep.
Also, this project, the interesting thing, which a lot of people don't understand, this started with Dylan's people. The book was optioned by Dylan's management, and they brought Chalamet on board to play Dylan, and then brought Mangold on board to direct.
Okay. Hmm.
As for why, when they first called me to option the book, my immediate thought was, why do they need my book? They have Dylan.
Well, and they have 100 other books as well to draw from.
Way more than 100.
Yeah.
Yeah. Having seen the movie, what I gather happened, and when I was doing the book, what made the book come alive for me was when I realized that instead of I had planned, my original idea was I do sort of, a potted history of the folk the folk revival, and then Dylan arrives, and was the moment of realizing you can do a potted history of the folk revival simply by doing a biography of Pete Seeger, because he was everything and everywhere, and every aspect of the folk revival came out of Pete. And once I realized that, it suddenly turned into a human story, where instead of it being Dylan in the folk scene, it's this evolving history of Pete Seeger developing this scene. Dylan comes on, they intersect, and then it rises to this moment in 1965 at Newport where their different visions collide. And that's what they did. That's why that's why I end up with a movie, because what Mangold and Jay Cox did was take that story and personalize it and write all these fictitious, but to me, very realistic. I think they did a great job. Scenes where that relationship of Dylan and Seeger actually is happening with them in the same rooms, in rooms they weren't together in. But to me, the film feels very true to both of them. And a thing I really like about it is there's always been this rock narrative in which Dylan is the brave young man going his own way, and Pete Seeger is the leader of the boring old folkies. And the film really, really doesn't do that. It treats Seeger as an equally honorable, equally committed figure who they just come into this moment where they're going in opposite directions.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. The casting, I think I haven't seen the film, but all the trailers and the sneak peeks I've seen, the casting is pretty terrific.
Ed Norton is amazing as Seeger. I mean, I just got an email from an old friend of Seeger's saying it was uncanny.
That's great. Now, how about Chalamet? I've heard nothing but good things. What's your review there?
It's interesting. He is not trying too hard to be Bob Dylan. I mean, as Chalamet has said in several interviews, Bob Dylan is still alive. You want to go see Bob Dylan, go see Bob Dylan.
Yeah.
He's doing a character who is, but that said, the music, if you want to know how Dylan played guitar, go watch Timothy Chalamet. I mean, he has got the guitar, and he's got the guitar down to the point. I don't know if you do this, but I'm one of these people who, like, I've really studied Joseph Spence, who none of you listeners probably have heard of, the Reverend Gary Davis, and you know that you've got it right when you start making mistakes and they sound like when those guys flubbed something, because you're actually holding your hands the way they held their hands. And Chalamet's playing that way on Dylan. I mean, one of my friends pointed out that when he does Blowing in the Wind, there's a moment where he goes to the 5 chord in one verse and doesn't do it in any of the others. And nerds that we are, we ran right back and listened to a bunch of Dylan versions. And yeah, he occasionally does that. I mean, it's a meticulous recreation. And I don't mean that in a bad way at all. I mean, he brings it alive. The music, him, Baez, Monica Barbaros, Baez, all the music first of all, there's a lot of music in the movie.
Yeah.
I think Chalamet plays bits of 30 Dylan songs.
All live.
And a couple of them almost all the way through. All of it's live. Yeah. And the music really, I mean, there are people complaining that the movie is not very deep. The movie is tracing the development of the music.
It's a 2-hour movie. What do people expect?
Well, the other thing is, I mean, there are people who come away feeling they don't really know Dylan after seeing the movie. It's, yeah, sure.
Good luck. Yeah. After 1,000 books, we still don't know Bob. And
there is a reason they called it A Complete Unknown.
Yes. Yeah.
I mean, he also, the thing that Chalamet also has pointed out several times is, he came to New York when he was 19
Right.
and breaks with the folk scene when he was 24.
Yeah.
We're not, anybody going in here looking for mature relationships needs to remember their own lives when they were 18 and 19 and 20.
Yeah. 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 What was that classic line of Dylan's about Baez when he said, "It's difficult to be something and in love at the same time"?
Oh, I don't know that one.
Oh, it's terrific. But uh, okay, let's see. Where do I want to go from here? There's so much. Oh, I wanted to ask about the Baez character because just from the trailers I've seen and whatnot, the music seems fantastic, and she sounds good, but she doesn't sound like Joan to me. And other people have said, "Oh, she just sounds exactly like Joan." And either
Well,
I'm
I mean,
missing it.
she doesn't sound exactly like Joan, but for someone who previous to this movie was not a singer,
Oh yeah,
that's the incredible performance in that sense. I mean, going in, what I'd been saying is, singing like Bob Dylan is an actor's job.
yeah,
Singing like Joan Baez is a whole different object because it's not about the phrasing, it's about the instrument. And Monica Barbaro doesn't sound just like Joan Baez, but she sure as hell pulls it off. I mean, if she had walked on stage in 1962 sounding like that, she would have had a very nice career.
yeah. Good point. Yeah, good point. Well, let's jump into Bob a little bit.
Sure.
As I think I mentioned to you in our correspondence, one of the things, I've been a fan for 50 plus years. Uh, I I guess I was too young to get into Dylan in those folk years. I was born in 56, but so when Dylan really started capturing me would be the Blonde on Blonde era. But what really did it for me were those early 70s records, Blood on the Tracks and Desire.
Huh.
But then, of course, I went back, right? Uh, Incredibly fascinating guy, and I've read a lot of books about him and call him one of the most influential songwriters for me personally as a songwriter, etc. Fascinated with him. But I just now am starting to grasp something that I wonder, and you might tell me I'm wrong about this, but I don't think I really realized the extent to which he didn't know what his destiny was when he went to New York, because he clearly, he said, "I knew I was going to be a star." Went out there he knew he had something inside of him, and he was born in the wrong place, and he had big plans, no doubt about it. But he's mainly known now as one of the greatest songwriters ever. And as Mangold says, the guy wrote half of the great songs of the 20th century. It seems to me, looking back now, that when he was 21 years old, he didn't know that's what his main mark on the
No,
world
not
was
at
going to
all.
be.
I mean, there are a few things that the movie, I'm not going to say gets wrong exactly, but there are things that the movie decides to do that are very much not the reality.
Yeah,
And the main one is it is the story of Bob Dylan, the songwriter. And there's actually on his first album, which had only two Dylan songs,
right.
in the movie that's treated as he has a bunch of his own songs, but John Hammond at Columbia wants this to be a folk album of old songs.
No,
And that's
Hammond told him.
absolutely,
Didn't Hammond just tell him, "You play whatever you want to play"? He gave him total
yeah.
freedom.
And Dylan only had those couple of songs. I mean, and, I think one of the things that people don't understand, um, because post Dylan, Woody Guthrie has also been transformed in the light of Dylan into the great songwriter.
Mm,
But Woody Guthrie, the reason people loved Woody Guthrie was the singing and guitar playing and harmonica playing and stories. And
sure.
yes, he wrote good songs, but if you go back and listen to Woody Guthrie's stuff, I would say, I would guess less than half of what he recorded were his own songs. And for me, or for Dylan, when we were singing Woody Guthrie songs, we were as likely to be singing Ranger's Command or Cannonball Blues or all these old Carter family songs, which was what enthralled us about Woody Guthrie as much as the writing. And the same with Dylan, except Dylan, it was even more Ramblin' Jack Elliott. I mean, Dylan came into New York not sounding like Woody Guthrie. He came into New York sounding like Ramblin' Jack and playing all these blues things. I mean, like the Reverend Gary Davis stuff, this is something people often get wrong, is they notice he's playing Cocaine Blues and Candyman from Reverend Gary Davis, and they go, oh yeah, he was hanging out with Dave Van Ronk. He plays Ramblin' Jack's versions of those. He plays Jack's version of San Francisco Bay Blues. And he was into blues because he'd been a rocker.
Right.
So he came in, he did that first album, which is largely blues. He spent the next year recording his second album, which also was almost entirely blues. And he actually released the single of Mixed Up Confusion with a full electric band and recorded That's All Right Mama,
Yeah.
Elvis's first hit, with an electric band.
Yeah.
And then Albert Grossman came on the scene. He wrote Blowing in the Wind. Albert Grossman handed it to Peter, Paul, and Mary. Dylan became the poet who has a rough voice and can't play much, but he writes these incredible lyrics, which the beautiful Peter, Paul, and Mary will bring to the world.
Mm-hmm.
And people just forgot that he'd been this hard-edged blues singer. And 4 years later, when he emerged again as this hard-edged blues singer, all these people went, oh my God, he's changed.
Yes.
And there's actually an interview he gave right after that where somebody said, does it bother you that all your fans are upset? And he said, those people weren't my fans.
My fans, yeah.
The people who knew me from the beginning, they're not surprised by any of this. It's the people who know me from Peter, Paul, and Mary.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's right.
Yeah.
I mean, he didn't become that guy, and he didn't abandon folk music, as by now we all know.
Right.
I mean, that's one of the funny parts, that like the histories still are being written the way people wrote the history in 1975 or 74 or whenever they started writing Dylan books, where he broke with the folk scene.
Right.
At Newport, he did break with the scene, but he absolutely wasn't breaking with the music. Right. I mean, I've been doing a thing called biography, where I post myself playing stuff and writing about them, and I'm about to post Maggie's Farm. And the thing I'm writing about it is, this is famous as, I ain't gonna work on Maggie's Farm no more. He's breaking with the folk scene. But he's breaking with the folk scene by rewriting a song the Bentley brothers recorded in 1929, Down on Penny's Farm.
Penny's Farm, yeah.
I mean, he's intensely engaged with that tradition in that moment and today.
Yeah, yeah.
And he remained friends with Pete Seeger.
Sure. And you did say at one point, by the way, that Bob did destroy Newport.
Oh yeah.
And I think he himself admitted a few times that he was sort of playing the bad boy, and he was really fucking with people in a lot of ways. But at the same time, as you're pointing out here, what people don't get is that it wasn't like he went to something new. He was going back to what he wanted to do all along.
There's that. And the other thing is the fact that he destroyed Newport. That I don't think he ever imagined that possibility. What he wanted to do was escape what was going, he had been turned into this character in a very constricting way.
Yeah.
And he wanted to escape that.
Yeah.
The fact that all these people who had seemed dedicated to folk music would jump ship behind him was not something anyone would have predicted.
Yeah.
And let's be clear, lots of people didn't. I mean, there were lots of serious folk people who kept doing folk after Dylan.
Yeah.
But the number of people who seemed dedicated to folk music until Dylan proved that you could become a rock star, and suddenly they were trying to be rock stars,
Yeah.
is pretty striking if you look back. You have to look back pretty hard because very few of them got anywhere. Most of them promptly disappeared.
And or turn back to folk.
Or we either have turned back to folk or simply, Dave Van Ronk, his famous comment, to me at least, on Dylan going electric and all the people who got upset. He said, it's like a guy I knew who was an editor of a Trotskyist newspaper. And there was a moment in the 60s when a bunch of New Left guys came up and started yelling at him about the New Left. He finally listened, finally turned and said, listen, I've been a radical for 50 years. You know what, you guys, 50 years from now, you guys are going to be dentists. And he said that, and that's the thing with Dylan. 50 years later, Dylan's out there still playing his music, and the people who criticized him are dentists.
Yeah. Yeah. By the way, I have to ask you, I've lived in Texas, wasn't born here, but I've lived in Texas most of my life. And speaking of folk, the folk thing carrying on even post Newport, have you been to Kerrville, the Kerrville Folk Festival?
I've never made it to Kerrville.
Okay. It's still going on, man. It's still happening. Yeah.
Yeah.
Hey.
No, and I mean, again, I ended up with a chip on my shoulder because I'm not a songwriter. I play old songs. I play all kinds of old songs.
Mm-hmm.
But I had the sense from Kerrville and from a lot of, I was trying to make a living as a musician in the 1980s. And everywhere I went, club after club after club, they'd say, so do you do originals? And I'd say I could do 2 hours of songs you've never heard. And they're like, no, it was all poetry readings with guitars. And I got a chip on my shoulder. And all I ever heard about Kerrville was that it was a songwriter showcase.
Definitely.
And it's like, I'm glad for good songs. And I do a lot of songs by Texas songwriters. And by now that's turned around and people are interested. But coming up in the 80s, those people, by and large, if you didn't write your own songs, they had no interest in you. And, I get it, but it ain't my world.
By the way, I'm as I sit here, I'm 20 minutes away from the grave of Vance Lipscomb, speaking of Texas.
Now that I like.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, I'm sure.
I mean, a bunch of the Texans I liked a lot. I mean, Joe Ely.
Yeah.
For me, Doug Somm and Joe Ely are foundational figures because both of them demonstrated to me, Waylon Jennings is another one, demonstrated to me that a lot of things I thought of as different kinds of music weren't different kinds of music. I mean, Doug Somm, the Doug Somm and Band album, which, as it happens, Dylan is on. I mean, the fact that you could put together a band with David Fathead Newman and Flaco Jimenez and Charlie McCoy and Kenny Kosick and Dr. John and David Bromberg, it's like, it's all just music, man.
Yeah.
And it was that album was a revelation for me.
Yeah.
And incidentally, Dylan at Newport in 65, when he's asked, so what are you listening to these days, says the Sir Douglas Quintet.
That's right. That's true. Hey, by the way, as a guy who plays out quite a bit gigs, it's sort of switched these days. I don't know what it is in your world, but down here, I want to play my originals and people want to hear covers. It's kind of switched. The places I play, they're like, a lot of them, they tolerate my originals, but what they really want is covers.
Well, I'm going to say two things. First of all, by now, listening rooms have disappeared.
Yeah. Well, there are some, but yeah.
And I mean, the bar crowd always wanted to hear familiar songs.
That's true.
There's nothing new about that.
Yeah,
in our day, it was Simon and Garfunkel and the Beatles, and there were plenty of gigs that neither I nor the singer-songwriters could get because they wanted people who'd play Simon and Garfunkel and Dylan and Beatles, and those gigs paid better than the folk clubs because they had liquor.
Yes.
And that's still around. The other thing is, the only thing in the movie that they get wrong that I actually resent is they use the term covers for folk songs,
Ah,
which nobody did in the 1960s.
uh-huh.
Nobody used that. That came in the
Right.
1980s with the songwriters sneering at people like me
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
and Van Ronk, who do
Yeah.
covers rather than being original.
Yeah.
Like every college kid who sounds just like Joni Mitchell is original because they're writing their own songs.
Uh,
Whereas Dave Van Ronk, who invented the fucking style, is doing covers.
cover.
Van Ronk used to go, yes, so are we now going to get albums called, Pavarotti covers Puccini?
Yeah. Yes. Yes. Wow. Yeah. Hey, something else I want to ask you about, and time is slipping away a little bit. I want to
Sure.
ask you about, and we don't need to go too deep into this, but the whole myth making thing of Dylan. In fact, I heard that he had some involvement in the script and of
Yeah.
the film and wanted to change some things. And he's always done it. Again, I get it. He's always been a guy not comfortable being, the boxes people put him in. And I've admired that about him, the way he kind of frustrates any attempt to define him. I I I've I've felt that myself, and I really admire that in a way about him. But something like this is kind of a weird connection, perhaps. But something lately has kind of started bothering me a little bit about that, and that is this Trump era we're in of fake news and what you can't believe anything, and there's no such thing as truth anymore. And this what I see is sort of the logical result of what started as the French deconstructionists, but we won't get into all that. But
I
we live in
couldn't
an
if
era,
I wanted to.
we live in an era now where the truth doesn't matter, and we say what we want to say, and it doesn't matter. Now suddenly I'm feeling a little uncomfortable about the fact that Dylan constantly was, let's be honest, lying about his past and who he is and whatnot. Is that a strange connection for you, or I just would ask you to respond to it?
Yeah, I mean, these are different things. I mean, the idea that artists are not historians doesn't bother me.
Yeah, but when someone asks him about his past and he says he was in New Mexico learning songs from Wigglefoot, um, it, it's funny. It's funny, but it's kind of like, Bob, you know, uh, um, I don't know. Maybe I'm
Let me,
making too much of it.
I mean, people who come from places that they don't want to have come from
Yeah,
and invent new identities for themselves.
yeah,
Um, you know, first of all, that's what the cowboy world was about. I mean, what
true.
was your
That's
name in
true.
the States?
That's true.
Is it, was an old folk song. What was your name in the States? Because the world of young people fleeing where they were from and reinventing themselves
Yeah, yeah.
is that's an individual reinvention.
You
It's
bet.
not an attempt to manipulate the world around you. On the
That's it.
contrary,
That's it.
it's an attempt to find a place for yourself
Yeah,
in the world around you.
yeah, yeah, yeah. That's it. That's the crucial difference. Is a lot of folks today are using the whole fake news kind of approach to in order to manipulate and be in control and empower. And Dylan had no interest in that whatsoever.
And he also wasn't telling other people, he wasn't calling out other people as
Right.
fakes
And
while doing that himself, while he was creating his own identity. He was in a world. This is something Van Ronk always said, we were all inventing ourselves in that moment. And
absolutely.
maybe Dylan, did it a little more expertly than, I mean, this is, I think, one of the things that has to be underlined. What Dylan was doing from beginning to end wasn't all that unusual. What was unusual was that he was incredibly talented.
Yes.
I
Yes.
mean, Van Ronk,
Yes.
anybody who says to Van Ronk, well, why was it Dylan? Why wasn't it X, Y, or Z? Van Ronk always took pride in the fact that the minute he saw that kid get on stage, he went, okay, that one's different.
Yeah. 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 I think the fascination will only only continue. Let me, if you don't mind, Elijah,
Sure.
and thank you so much for doing this. I've really enjoyed this. Let's wind down here with just a couple of kind of quick questions, sort of lightning round, if you will. Just kind of
Sure.
what comes to mind with some questions here. This is completely unfair, but we'll just see what comes to mind. Most memorable show you've ever attended, gig that you, what
Oh God,
immediately
there's
comes
so
to mind?
many.
Oh, of
Yeah,
course.
I'm gonna go the first and only New England Blues Festival, which went, what was it? Roomful of Blues, Coco Taylor, Junior Wilson, Buddy Guy, Willie Dixon,
Mm.
uh, Freddie King, B.B. King, Muddy Waters, who because of the rest of it ends up with Willie Dixon, Junior Wilson, Buddy Guy. Yeah, I'll take that one.
Yeah. Interesting. When I answer that question, often I say when I sat at the feet of Muddy Waters, about 1972 or so. That was incredible. Okay, one. This is the horrible cliche question, but I'd still like to ask people. One album. You can only listen to one album. Let's not say A Deserted Island. Let's say for the next 3 weeks, you can only listen to one record. What do you choose?
Uh, Typically, I'm going to go with Joseph Spence Bahamian folk guitar.
Okay.
Always. Just
Okay.
because it's so deep. That's one, no matter how much I listen to it, I hear something new every time.
Okay. Right on. What do you like most about living in? You said Philadelphia is where you're living.
Yeah.
What do you like most about living there?
Um, it's a black city. It's a reasonably inexpensive city, which means that a lot of young, interesting people can still move here, which is not true of any other city I know of that has the cultural richness that this place has. And for the same reason, I can afford to live here, and it's interesting, it's fun, and I'm 65 years old. This place feels more like New York in the 1970s than New York does, far and away. It's
Gotcha.
a place that for someone my age, this is what a city should feel like.
Nice.
They're in the process of destroying it, but we'll see how long it hangs on.
Uh, Pet peeves. What you seem to be a very positive guy, but like anyone else, you get down once in a while. You get disappointed. You get frustrated with life. What are some pet peeves that tend to get to you a little bit?
I'm gonna go back, people calling folk songs covers.
Okay.
Um,
Yeah, it's a good one.
I mean, look, we're living in a world where I'm very politically engaged. Um, there's an awful lot wrong with what's going on around us right now. I blame the internet for an awful lot of it. I wish people would get the hell off their phones, starting with me.
Yeah.
I mean, I still have an old flip phone because if I didn't, I would be looking at my goddamn phone all the time.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. If you were going to write another book, and whether it's about Bob or involving Bob, which era would you choose? There's so
I'm
many
done.
to choose. But you're
Yeah,
done.
no, you have to understand. Unlike you, my interest in Bob Dylan ends at Highway 61. I
Yeah.
don't think Blonde on Blonde is a bad album, but he's already starting to sing in that mannered way.
Okay.
And I remember when I first heard Blood on the Tracks, my reaction was, this is the best Dylan imitation I'm ever going to hear, but it ain't the real thing. And And
Okay.
interestingly enough, when Chronicles came out and and people were asking him, he agrees with me. He
Okay.
says, he had this electric, magical thing through Blonde on Blonde, and then he lost it.
Uh,
And since then, he's been honing his craft, and he's a very expert craftsman.
mm,
But that thing of just these incredible lines just falling on him from the sky.
mhm. Yeah.
So yeah, for me, that's the Dylan period. And I never expected to write a Dylan book in the first place. I did this one because suddenly I thought of a book I could write
Yeah.
and stop at Highway 61.
Yeah. Yeah. That sort of tracks with what he said in that Ed Bradley interview when he said, I can't do that anymore.
Yeah.
I did that once, but I can't do it anymore.
I mean, I like what he does now, but
Yeah.
he changed what he did in that moment changed the world.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, he's not changing the world with his new stuff. That's true. If you had a nephew or a niece who said, "I want to be a writer," what kind of advice would you give them?
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, that's the only, I mean, it's as simple as that. The
Yeah.
difference between writers and non-writers is that writers sit down and write.
Yeah. Yeah. Good. Good.
It certainly isn't that they have good ideas for stories. Everybody on earth has good ideas for stories.
Do you have any, and this may be too personal if you don't, obviously don't have to answer it, but do you have any guiding spirituality or philosophical principles that you lean on to help you get by?
Not if we're talking God stuff. I mean, you treat people decent.
Yeah.
And I'll go beyond that. Treat people decent and assume that they are decent. I'm a hitchhiker. I mean, if I have a spirituality, it's hitchhiking. It's you go out on the road, you stick your thumb out. Nice people will stop for you. Anybody who thinks that if you go out on the road and stick your thumb out, you're going to get raped and murdered. I don't remember where I read this, but I read somewhere someone saying, if you trust everybody, you will occasionally get robbed. If you mistrust everybody, you will spend your entire life surrounded by thieves.
Mm.
That's
Wow.
the one I'll live by.
Okay. Yeah. On that note, Elijah Wald, thank you so much for doing this. It's an honor to speak with you. You are an extremely fascinating guy. I will put show notes or links in the show notes so people can find out more about you and see your books and your music. Anything else you'd like to say before we head off?
No, I think we covered lots of bases. It was
did
fun.
indeed. We did indeed. Thank you so much. Take care.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.